So the topic for today is militarism and surveillance in academic research. And this is, I think always an important topic for us to be aware of. It's a longstanding relationship that the academy has had with the military and defense projects. In fact, many of our technological innovations have come because of the needs of the military and those advances. And so this is just, I think this is really important background for us to have so that we can really decide how we want to take how we want to move in our research and to be prepared to take full responsibility for the research that we're doing and make sure that that is aligning with our values. And I think it's also important for us to keep in mind, especially nowadays, violence can take many forms, and much of that is data driven. And so data, it's thinking about the role of data, something that, all of our lives are filled with, both on our personal side and our professional world. So the agenda for today, we will begin by talking about foundational concepts. And I'll just generally introduce the topic. I'm going to provide you a bit of a history of data, specifically around the linkages between computer science and the military, and data and racial capitalism. And then I'll give you some discussion questions and closing. So our two foundational concepts today is militarism and surveillance. And our first term, militarism, is one way to think about this is the extent to which our culture, our ways of thinking and moving are shaped by the needs of war. So like, how does the military and the needs of war influence our everyday lives? Many of us have flown. Even the normalization of airport security is a great example, where going through the scanner machines, we are asked to, put our hands up in the air in a way that mimics a sort of like surrender. We can also think about the increasing normalization of drones. Drones, a technology originally created for the military that to this day, we have people going and using unmanned drones for killing missions. And so we know drones are, literally killing people in other countries in our name. And, some of those are reaching their intended targets. Some of them are not. Some of them are reaching civilians. But that's not the drones we see and think about in our everyday lives. In our everyday lives, the drones we often see are the ones that are sort of like toys, like flying in the air, taking pictures from the sky, doing cool videos. But this is the same type of technology. And I think it's important to recognize that, because sometimes the focus on one thing can kind of negate the attention we give to the violence in another space. Another example of militarism in our everyday lives is just, the regimented school systems we have. And I'm sure we could, continue to think of many other examples. So that's our definition of militarism, is how our culture, way of thinking and moving is shaped by the needs of war. As if we're always already preparing to mobilize for war. Surveillance, we're very familiar with surveillance in our everyday lives. In fact, at this point, we almost expect surveillance. There is this expectation that a camera could be anywhere. And we also know that we may always be surveilled online, sometimes in some cases, literally with every stroke. Similar surveillance is also being used as a sort of tool of everyday life. We see the new doorbells that have a video camera to record who's there, and you can see who's at your front door from even when you're not home on your smartphone. The use of nanny cams to see children when they're sleeping, but also maybe when the babysitter's there, so the parents can see, quote unquote, what's really going on. And so surveillance and this right to surveil and the lack of right we experience to not be surveilled, as if like, we must subject ourselves to surveillance, is an example of how this is of the impact of another specific example of the impact of militarism on our everyday lives. This didn't just happen. I mean, there's a long history of how militarism has really come to impact our everyday lives and our research culture. And one great example is to talk about the really deep linkages between the history of computer science and the history of militarism. To give you an example of this, a lot of what we now think of as the field of computer science began through funding from early defense contracts and early defense research budgets. One example of a figure in this was a professor who worked to share this within his existing academic networks to help with projects such as interactive computing, graphic interface design, networking, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. And one person whose work was really integral to the early rise of computer sciences was Norbert Wiener. And he was an early did a lot of really interesting work on cybernetics. Later on in his career, he came to see the type of implications that his research could have and the sorts of violence, militarized violence that could be wrought via the theories and ideas that he had helped to bring forth. And this is a quote from a book about him. Wiener envisioned a bleak future and realized that he himself was culpable, comparing his work on cybernetics to that of the world's greatest scientist who unleashed the destructive power of atomic weapons. And so this is an example of a researcher that has really interesting ideas of cybernetics have been applied to all sorts of different fields that have all sorts of really powerful insights coming from this, and also had insights in an area where the researcher wouldn't have necessarily wanted to have an impact, that is in the creation of war. And so Wiener actually went on to devote more of his work to actually anti-war activism because of this experience. But of course, there's always other people willing to kind of carry the banner, so to speak. And one of these people was J.C.R. Licklider, and he went by the name Lick. And as you can see from the quote here, Lick's job was to develop the underlying computer and networking technology necessary to fight modern warfare. He was one of the major figures who really started to create computer science as we know today, to create what was known as the ARPANET, which later would go on to sort of be the groundwork for what we now use, I'm using right now, and we all use every day, of the internet. And this was not necessarily, though, without protests from people within the university that learned of this. So one example is this graphic you see on the left is a graphic of the way, sort of like some of the ways that the ARPANET was configured. One example of the sort of pushback against the militarization of academic research occurred when activists from Students for Democratic Society were able to access a confidential ARPA proposal written by Lick. And essentially what they saw in there was the creation of a joint Harvard-MIT program that would directly contribute to counterinsurgency missions. And because of that, the students, led a protest because they could see that this sort of technology was also was being weaponized in the way that they didn't necessarily agree with. And this would go on to create other forms of network technology that would later lead to the technologies that we're seeing today, such as Palantir, a data mining and surveillance and prediction software that has been used with intelligence planners today, has also, been potentially accused of impacting elections, even in our own country. And so a lot of manipulation is possible with these technologies. The second history I kind of want to lay out briefly is the relationship between the history of data management and the history of capital and racism. And one really great example to help you understand this relationship is redlining. What we see here is a map of Sacramento divided up between the quote unquote desirable neighborhoods where white people were able to buy houses and get really great mortgages. And we see yellow lined communities where those opportunities were not available. And we see redline communities where they were also not available, and where many Black communities were limited to residing within those regions, which were also consequently disinvested. this map was created through data analysis of who already lived there. In other words, racism was baked into the data analysis plan. Part of how they decided whether or not a neighborhood would be considered desirable was based on who already lived there. What was their race? What was their socioeconomic class? So we see this is a great example of early discrimination by design. And unfortunately, that is a trend that has continued in some of our data management practices. Another current day example of this is the overrepresentation of policing of communities of color, of people of color within policing data sets. We have now predictive technologies that some of our police departments are using to determine where crimes will happen or who may be likely to commit crimes. And these sorts of softwares are driven by the existing data, and the existing data is fundamentally biased in the sense that it is driven by past arrest reports and so on and so forth that are driven by racial bias. And this sort of use of technology to limit the mobility of people, to limit people's access to a full range of experiences of living in different neighborhoods, of being able to move freely, is something that's happened not just in the US, but also in Palestine. In fact, we see a lot of literally the same technologies being used in both sites. And this is something that is not lost upon many who work in the movement for Black lives and within the in support of Palestinians. So what you see here is a wall within the Palestine territory with a picture of George Floyd, because that was recognized as a site of mutual solidarity. Another example I wanted to mention is facial recognition technology. There's been some really interesting conversations happening recently about the way that facial recognition technology is, one, used for surveillance, and two, fundamentally biased in that it is much more likely to recognize a white male with accuracy than a person of another race or gender, with Black women being the most unrecognizable of all general demographics. Now, this is changing, and the reason it's changing, the reason that data sets are becoming more diversified, is in large part because of the research of Black women within the field of technology. One great example of this is Joy Buolamwini, who helped create a movie called Coded Bias. And in this, she demonstrates the way that facial recognition technology is much less accurate in analyzing Black faces. This was based on her own experience of trying to use a facial recognition software herself and having it not recognize her own face. And it wasn't until she put on a white mask, as you see alluded to in this image, that it recognized her. And so because of her work, we saw a large growth in and change in the way that many data sets were comprised. And this is also a problem. We combine this with the overrepresentation within policing data sets, because when a technology such as facial recognition software is not accurate, it means that there will be more people being stopped when it's not necessarily warranted. And because of this, the Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft all put a moratorium on selling facial recognition software to police. I know that relationships have continued, and I don't know the current status of that, but this is all the sorts of uses of which research in the academy is being put towards, that I think it's important to think about, like how, what are the potential uses of our own research? Because companies that we all use every day, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, are working also within surveillance industries. And so, here's another example of Microsoft funding an Israeli firm that engaged in surveillance of West Bank Palestinians. When this became more public, there actually was a protest among Microsoft employees that led to Microsoft disinvesting in that particular firm. So I'm kind of talking about the politics of where we have data and what that data is used for and where we don't have data. So the facial recognition technology being like an example of where we don't have data and what are the consequences of that. Another place I really want you all to think about is what are the other data sets that we don't have? One artist created a project called the Library of Missing Data Sets. And in this, she created a filing cabinet full of files, and each of the files represented something that we do not have data on. And so you can see here the example of publicly available gun trace data. Although I have learned from one of our own researchers here at UC Davis that this is a gap that people are currently working on filling. We also see examples of, in this file of cause of June 2015 Black church fires, accurate birth registration, accurate historical weather data. There's all sorts of different data sets that this artist was pointing out how these data sets missing in order for us to think about the question of why don't we have accurate data sets here? And is it because we can't get it? Is it because we don't necessarily are making that a priority? Is it because of power? What is the reason? And so I encourage you all to think about what are data sets that you wish existed, or maybe may exist, but you don't necessarily have access to, or you wish you had access to. And I should apologize if anyone was seeing any of those examples in those files and they said, oh no, that data set actually does exist. My apologies. And, and we're always getting new data, which is great. So that's something I hope you all can talk about in your discussions as well. Another question I invite you to think about in your discussion is, what would data science be, or what would it look like if it was not based on surveillance? Because part of what I want to kind of relay to you today is the ways that our use of data in our computer systems are really strongly and intricately linked to militarism and surveillance. And I wonder if we can think about, like, how could we shift or transform our relationship to data in a way that may be capable of doing something different other than sort of, enforcing violence or limiting movement of our fellow humans. Because I think a lot of us as researchers, we want our research to be doing a lot more than that. So here's some points for discussion today. One, I invite you to free write a vision for data sciences that is based on something other than surveillance and militarism. Like, what do you want, or what do you wish data to do in this world? So that's one option of a thing you can talk about in your small groups. Another option is you can talk about what are the connections between your researcher field and militarism or surveillance. You can also think about what data sets are missing in your field and why, and what would it take to create them? In other words, like, what are the politics of the data we have versus the data we don't have? And finally, what are the strengths and challenges of using old versus new data sets, especially in relation to equity? I thought this could be an interesting question because, in some fields, using what I'm saying old, but another way of putting that is sort of reliable data sets that are considered reliable data sets that many people have used before, because those have a sense of comparability. There is a sort of weight that some of those data sets may carry in terms of their authenticity, in terms of representing real life experiences, versus new data sets which may be filling a gap that needs to be filled, but may at this point be sort of quote unquote unproven. So that could be an interesting discussion for you all to think as it relates to your own fields and research. I don't necessarily expect all groups to discuss all 4 of these questions, but I think it offers a couple different interesting directions for you all to go. And the other thing I expect that many of you will want to discuss today is to continue to work on your action plans. And so I wanted to kind of offer you a few further suggestions on how you could work to further your action plan. I heard from some of the facilitators that it sometimes it can be hard, especially as a graduate student, to think about what you can do on a larger scale, sometimes even than just yourself. And so I wanted to just kind of offer a few suggestions of how to start in moving towards justice in your research. And these are kind of like small things, but they're things that really accumulate over time. And I can say this, based on my own experience for certain. One thing is, maybe your plan is just, you are going to identify ways that you can seek out allies. When you go to conferences, to look and scan panels for people that are doing their work in an approach that more resonates with you. It may be, looking among your classmates, or when you read papers. These are all, if you read a paper by an author that you really think is doing work in your field in a different and more equitable way, to reach out to him and maybe just say like, thank you. I can guarantee you authors love to just hear a thank you, your article really had an impact on me. People love those emails. Another example is if you're in a position where you're mentoring undergraduates, you can think about your own mentoring practices and mentor in a way that aligns with your own values. You can also research oppression in your own field. You could research, what is the history of your field? How is your field implicated within white supremacy, colonialism, patriarchy? Is there already work being done to address these histories, or maybe to address oversimplistic ways that race or sex or gender is thought about in your field? These are all sort of places you can just start your own research. And if actually undertaking all that research is too much, there's two other options you consider. One is to start or participate in a reading group, and the other is just to keep a list of the projects that you see that are cool. Maybe you don't have time to read all the articles now, but just throw them in a file. When you have time, you can look at them. Or keep what I like to call is like a list of all the research projects you wish you could do, but now isn't necessarily the time. And so think about how you could keep like a research wish list that you occasionally come back to and just sort of, think and imagine, because all of you eventually will be in a position where you can set your own research agendas. And it's great to spend time now thinking about how you can do that. So when you're in that position, you can move in a much more advanced and sophisticated way. So these are all things that could inform or be a part of your action plan. With that, I'm going to let you all get into your discussions. Next week is the last really content heavy week we're going to have. And we'll be talking about toxic landscapes, environmental justice, and health inequities. And then we'll have off the week of Thanksgiving. And then the week we return, we'll just sort of be doing more of a wrap up. So I thank you all and hope you have wonderful discussions.